Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. And today we're going to be talking about one of our favorite astrological techniques called annual profections, which is a really simple technique that almost every ancient Hellenistic astrologer used to help identify what are the most potent currents and themes in your life at any given time. And we're going to give a high level overview of what annual profections are and why they're so great to work with. But I am teaching a workshop coming up on December 18th that will then also be recorded and made available for folks who might listen to this podcast afterwards. So if you really want to dig into the nuances of annual profections and how to tie it to your own personal birth chart, there's information on how to sign up for that down below. And for folks who sign up for it before Friday the 13th this year in 2024, you'll also get a free bonus with a 30-page document talking about the transits of 2025, which I'm sure Lori and I will talk more about the transits of 2025 in future episodes, but 2025 is a huge year astrologically with Pluto in Aquarius and then Uranus ingressing into Gemini for a bit and Neptune ingressing into Aries. So there's some really big collective shifts. So if you want to learn more about what 2025 has in store for you and how to make it really personal, you can go down below and sign up for that. But in the meantime, here's just a really great taster of how to work with annual profections and why it's so potent to have techniques that you can use in your day-to-day life that help personalize astrology in such powerful ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
So, profections, the concept is that you can move or perfect, which is a weird word, but I had like made a page about it and my teacher was like, "Do you mean to say perfections? Like, is this a typo?" And like the word is profections, and it perfection comes from a Latin word that the medieval astrologers would use to describe the technique. And that word is profectio, which means that you're setting out or departing, because the concept is that you depart from your ascendant and then you perfect or move the ascendant forward each year. And so what that means is that for everyone, this is a pattern that is the same for all of us. When we're 0, when we're 12, when we're 24, we're all in first house perfection years. And then it moves forward year by year. So you're in these patterns where in different years of your life, like I just turned 29, so I entered a sixth house perfection year. Different years of your life, different topics of your life are highlighted. So last year I was really focused on my hobbies and I started a relationship and I was really focused on dating and things that brought me a lot of pleasure because I was in a fifth house year. And now that I've entered a sixth house year, there's more of a focus on work and activism and like chores, and especially in the sixth house, focusing on your health and what your body needs and like the regular maintenance your body needs is really important. And so when you know
Mhm.
what house is perfected, which you don't even need to know your birth time to know that because it's the same for all of us based off our age, then you can know like, oh, this is a really good time to be focusing on my career or my relationships or my money based off of what your age is and what house is perfected.
Yeah, yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Um, it's such a great and such a simple technique to use, and I've found it so interesting to look back on just how potent these themes tend to be. And even when you don't realize it's playing out in the moment, like even before I understood astrology, and then looked back when I understood this technique, you can really see a lot of patterns and things playing out. And it's gotten to a point too where like I'll be giving somebody a reading and or even just talking to somebody and they'll be
Mhm.
talking about something that happened to them and I'll be like, "Oh, are you this age?" And they're like, "Yeah, how do you know?" And I'm like, "Well, what you're saying just sounds very like 10th house perfection year or like 7th house perfection year or whatever." Um and it's pretty crazy how it really
Mhm.
shows up that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me go ahead and share my screen so that you can see just
The
having a
bio wheel.
visual of the wheel. You can see that, right, Lori?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, so this is just how to quickly and easily identify what house is perfected for you based off of your age. And then just a brief list of some, not all house topics, because the houses are where astrology becomes very like tangible and terrestrial of like, okay, if the planets are doing this in the sky, what does that mean for me in my day-to-day life? And to fit every life topic into 12 areas of the chart means that there's things like, the third house is neighborhood and siblings and communication and magic and like these seemingly disconnected things. And so this is just a list of some of the brief house topics. If you're not familiar with houses in astrology, Lori and I are actually going to be doing more episodes about that in 2025. But
Yeah.
and it also doesn't mean that, if you're in a third house perfection year, like if you don't have siblings, then siblings won't be activated, or your neighborhood might not feel as activated as communication. So it's personal for everyone, but it's giving you an idea of what you can experience and what topics are highlighted at different points. So this bi-wheel can be really helpful for identifying that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always thought it was funny that 23 was a 12th house perfection year because of that
Hmm.
Blink-182 song that no one likes you when you're 23, and that's been such a joke. Like even just little cultural things like that I've found to be very
Hmm.
prominent, or like I found those things to show up or make sense.
And that's a really good point because I've noticed that with a lot of my friends as they've moved through being 23 and like
Yeah.
had really difficult years, is perfections can also give you a lot of context. If you're having a rough go of it, it might be because you're in a 12th house or a sixth house or an eighth
Yeah.
house year. Like you might just be in a year where more difficult life topics are being activated.
Yeah.
And just in general, that's one thing that I find really comforting with astrology is it gives you a timeline. So if you're
Hmm.
23 and things are just really intense, or if you're 35 or 59, then
Yeah.
it will shift when you turn your next age and enter your first house year. So it does help give a timeline for that. But if you know you're coming into a 12th house or sixth house or eighth house year, planning to give yourself more time for rest and being on your own and tending to your body and not, that's not necessarily the year to like write a bunch of books and go on tour and like be super public in the world. I mean, maybe for you it might be, but generally it's a better time for rest and retreat.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So like kind of just understanding the topics of that house that you're in, and then the sign that shows up for
Mhm.
you. Um and what I've actually noticed the most that from this technique, maybe not the most, but something I really like to look at because I have a bit of a background in medical astrology, and I love the body side of everything. A lot of my work has always been revolving around like circus movement, body work. And I have noticed that anytime I've ever had any kind of like injury or not even like necessarily hurting myself, but like I've had any kind of body issues or like something went wrong, it has coincided with the sign that was on the cusp of that house. So for example, I remember very specifically when I was 27, which is a fourth house perfection year. That's Libra for me. I'm a Cancer rising. And I tweaked my lower back doing acro, like doing something that I've done a million times. But I was really stressed out that day about something that was going on with like a home situation, like something was going wrong in my apartment. And I remembered like very vividly like being so stressed about like some fourth house topics, fourth house issues, and doing something I've done a million times, but not paying attention and tweaking my lower back. And I actually went home and journaled about it a ton. And about a year or two later, when I really started using annual profections more seriously, I looked back on when that happened and what the transits were. And I just thought it was really funny that that was a fourth house perfection. And I have so many other examples like it. I was struggling with my knee all year. In I guess it was just last year, last summer, so 2023. And that was a seventh house perfection year for me when I was 30, and it was a Capricorn perfected year.
Hmm.
So it was a Saturn ruled year, and I was just finishing up my Saturn return, which was in Aquarius. And so I just thought it was funny that like my knee was having issues. And then this year, since I've been 31, I'm going to be 32 in a month. Um, but since I've been 31, I've noticed like really weird circulation issues, specifically in my feet. Like my toes will randomly go numb, and this isn't like something that's never happened before. And now that I think about it, I do remember like when I was 19, 20, this happening. Like in college, I remember having some issues with this, but my circulation's just been really weird, and I've been noticing like my toe will go numb if I'm cold, and then like 3 minutes later it's fine again, but they'll kind of switch off or it'll happen a little bit. And I'm in an Aquarius profection year, which Aquarius rules circulation, and Saturn is transiting through Pisces, which rules the feet. Um, and so I've just thought it was funny, like anytime I've gotten kind of stressed, which I've had a very eighth house year, this has been such an eighth house year, and every time there's been any kind of stress around any of those topics, I've noticed my toes being an issue even more so. And what's funny is like it has gotten to a point where it should have been something that's concerned me or worried me, or like maybe in the past I would have like done something about it, but there's some sort of like, oh, it's just this perfection year. Like I'll get it checked out if it doesn't go away when I turn
Hmm.
32. Like there's almost this like it doesn't matter almost. Like maybe that's not a great way of saying it, but there's like a calmness to it because I
Mm.
understand this.
Well, and I feel like that's also just reflective of your moon and Aries and all of your
Yeah.
Aquarius that you are like, I am a robot
Yeah.
sometimes. And that
Fair.
works really well for you and your
Hmm.
vitality. Whereas like for me, I've also had uh like I tore my ACL earlier this year when I
Hmm.
was still in my Aquarius perfection year. So Saturn was my time lord. Saturn was in charge of me for that year. And Saturn, as Lori said, rules the knees.
Hmm.
And that one particularly. I'll get more into that when we talk a little bit more about monthly perfections because there's even more about
Sure.
that. But just in response to what you're saying, because I have a lot of sixth house energy, and in particular, like I have my Saturn in my sixth house and it's in Pisces. I'm very different from Lori, where I feel like I'm constantly having to work and
Hmm.
maintain my body and be very proactive. If I notice I have a little bit of a cold, I'm immediately taking all of the immune herbs I can. And, if I need, like, I had really bad pain in my leg after the surgery, and I immediately went to get an ultrasound in case it was a blood clot. So it just depends on, like, if you're
Sure.
more of the Lori, like, I'm a robot, then it can just help give you, like, okay, well, this is happening. If it keeps happening, maybe I'll worry about it. If you're more like me and you have all this like terrifying sixth house energy, then maybe you do want to actually go get it checked out. But regardless,
For sure.
using profections helps, like, and that's one of the big things we honestly just wanted to talk about with this technique is
Hmm.
having the context of knowing what's going on in your life astrologically. Like, if you went outside in the rain and you tried to tan, you would be cold and wet and frustrated, and like you wouldn't be meeting the conditions appropriately. Whereas if you went out with like your rain boots and like a little kid and you're like bouncing around in the puddles, and it's like knowing the weather and the context that you're in really helps you meet the conditions and make sense out of them. And because
Yeah,
annual
absolutely.
perfections are so simple, if you just know your age, you can be like, okay, do the math, figure out what the year is, or just look at the wheel. It can just give you so much agency in your life to make sense of like when things are more difficult. It can make sense of it. It can help you identify when there's more opportunities and when there is support available. And yeah, it's just astrology is like checking the weather or looking at a map before you go on a hike. It's just so helpful. And especially those techniques that are really simple and easy to work with in your day-to-day life, and those techniques that make things really personal, which annual perfections is both of those. They're just like such powerful techniques to have in your toolkit.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for me, like something that always helps is just being able to look at it and like see why something is
Hmm.
happening. Or um what I've like really worked with is, you know, a lot of things that go wrong or the reason why you might feel some stressors in the body are not always, not 100% of the time, but almost always related back to stress. And
Hmm.
so, a big point of like kind of understanding yourself and what's going on around you, is kind of trying to like figure out how to diminish some of those stressors. And I think like
Hmm.
annual perfections has been a big way for me to be like, okay, wait, why am I like particularly worried about money this year? Oh, I'm in an eighth house perfection. And,
Hmm.
and there's other things, Mars is retrograding in my second house and opposite my sun, which is the ruler of it. Like there are always other things that are showing these things, but like this might just be something that is a theme, something that you worry about, something that brings blessings or good things, it's not always bad. It's often not bad.
Hmm.
And so like what is the theme of this year? Like what is to be expected? What should you look for? And then if you start to notice, that's kind of what I use the medical astrology stuff for. It's like when I start to notice, oh, my toes are going numb, I'm like, wait, why am I really stressed today? Or like,
Hmm.
kind of taking that step back, like, why is this something that I'm worried about? Um, and so much of this like can really bring you so much self-awareness and
Hmm.
yeah, just so cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you had mentioned earlier too, so there's the house that's perfected for
Hmm.
all of us at each year in our lives, but then to really make that personal for what that means for you and how that feels for you, looking at the sign that is on that house. So if I just entered a sixth house perfection year and I'm a Libra rising, that means I'm in a Pisces perfection year. And then, you can even just stop there and be like, okay, well, Pisces is a water sign. And so if I'm moving from an Aquarius year to a Pisces year, air moves upwards, right? Air is very external. It's very focused on other people. It's very fast moving. Water, when you pour it, moves down into the earth. It's a lot more internal. It still is a social sign, but it's a lot more like who's close and safe to you rather than air signs that might be a bit more extroverted in how they're social. Water is very emotional. It's the element that allows for all life to exist. It's focused on healing. So you can even think like, is air activated? Is fire? Is earth? What element is activated for you by profection? You can look at the modality of the sign if you work with that. So Pisces being a mutable sign, I'm moving into a year where I might be like a little more flexible or adaptable or a little more scattered in what I'm focused on. Whereas when I was in an Aquarius year, things might have felt a little more fixed and stable and consistent because Aquarius really likes that and it's a fixed sign. And then you can look at what planets are in that house, if you have any. So for me, I have my moon and Saturn in Pisces. So my Pisces perfection year is going to be more activated than someone who doesn't have any Pisces planets. And that also means that like my moon and Saturn and what they're doing in my chart, their stories are brought through the whole perfection year. And then, and most importantly,
Yeah.
you can look at the planet that rules the sign being perfected, and that planet then becomes your time lord for the year. So if I'm in a Pisces year, Jupiter is my time lord for the year. And so I'm in a year that's very much of the nature of Jupiter. It's a good year to be generous, to focus on expansion. I might experience a bit more luck or opportunity, especially because I have Jupiter in Sag, so I have a strong Jupiter. And so you can look at like the general significations of the planet who's in charge of you. And then you can look at the condition of that planet in your chart, what they're doing, what their natal promise is. And then you can also look at what the planet is doing in your solar return chart for additional nuance. And so that's what's so great about annual perfections is like depending on where you are at astrologically, you can get so much out of it regardless. So if you're more of a beginner astrologer, or if you don't even know your birth time, you can be like, okay, if I'm in a sixth house perfection year, what life topics are activated and how do I work with that? Or if you are a beginner astrologer who knows your birth time, you're like, okay, well, what does Pisces mean? How is Pisces showing up for me? But if you're an advanced astrologer, you can get all the way down into the weeds. And it's not even, the weeds aren't that tough. So like even if you are a beginner astrologer, like getting into more of like assessing planetary condition and the nuance of like how your Jupiter, like Lori's Jupiter in Libra, is going to give her a different Pisces year than my Jupiter in Sag does. It's such a good way to get into a lot of ancient Hellenistic techniques and make them very applicable in your day-to-day personal life without getting like some of the other Time Lord techniques. Lori and I went to a Time Lord retreat with Demetra George in Denver in
Mm-hmm.
June earlier this year that was fascinating and taught us so many really in-depth techniques. And I'm so amazed by all of the astrologers who are doing really cool stuff with zodiacal releasing and
Hmm.
circumambulations and all of these other techniques. But for me personally, I really like the astrology that you can easily apply in your day-to-day life while still getting a lot of meaning from it, because I
Yeah.
just am not someone who wants to do like a bunch of math and like get super
Yeah.
into the granular details. And annual profections, there's a reason why almost every single Hellenistic author whose texts survive mentions this technique. It's very
For sure.
effective. It's very easy to work with. And there's so many ways that you can like really add nuanced personalization to what, like we all have the same patterns. We'll all be in a sixth house perfection year when we're 29, 41, 53. But what that means for us individually becomes very personal. And there's a lot of ways that you can pull that out. And so
Yeah.
again, I'm teaching a workshop on this if you do want to dig into more of like the personal nuances for what that means for you.
Yeah. Um, so I actually want to make it a little tiny bit more complicated and bring in the asteroids real quick,
Mm.
as I do. But so here's something that I've actually been finding in a lot of my research, and I'll actually plug, we're doing a workshop on the asteroids. It's actually local and at my shop on next Sunday, which I'll have the details are on my Instagram. But we're gonna record it, and so it'll be available if anybody wants to jump in at a different time. Um, but there's something like really interesting about annual perfections and the Time Lords that I've been finding with a lot of my asteroid stories. Um, so I went down this crazy rabbit hole, actually several. I probably could sit here and talk for like 4 hours on crazy stories that Time Lords have been important in asteroid stories. Um, but the one I'm going to choose to share, I just wrote an article on this too, which I haven't shared yet. But
Mm.
I went down this rabbit hole on Set and Horus and their story in Egyptian mythology. And that sent me down this crazy rabbit hole of looking into different ways that a story like that could play out in people's charts. And so, what that ended up showing me, and I'll try to refrain from telling the entire story right now, because I did write like a 5-page article on it, so it's long. But what I found, which was really crazy, was that I think there could be an aspect of Horus and Set's story that shows some sort of like sexual abuse or like somebody who has authority over you taking advantage of you. And I had just watched the Nickelodeon documentary when I was doing first diving into this research. So I instantly thought about Amanda Bynes. And I wondered if she had this, the Horus asteroid prominent in her chart. And I looked, and she had it like 6 or 7 degrees away from her Venus. And her Venus was, I think, in Cancer in her 12th. Or it was in Taurus, sorry, in her 12th. And so I remember looking at that and being like, okay, like not as prominent as I expected, but it still felt like a pretty intense story, right? Well, then I went down this crazy rabbit hole where I ended up adding Dan Schneider's chart into it, and I found that he had the Seth asteroid, exactly where her Horus asteroid was. And long story short, the years that he first found her and a lot of the abuse was reported were when she was 10 years old, and when she was 15, 16 years old, she ran away from home and called him. And there were a bunch of stories where it sounded like there was some sort of abuse between the two of them. And I found that it was 10 and 16, um, that like seemed to be really, really big years for her, but it was 15 that a lot of this started. And those were both Venus perfection years. And
Mm.
so it was the years that for her, Venus was her Time Lord, that this was activated. And I know I'm trying to like shorten this and not give every single detail, so that's kind of hard. But I've found stories like this over and over and over where I would find an asteroid that I thought would be more prominent in somebody's story. And then once I added other people's charts or other people involved and found the asteroids that coincided with their stories, but then looked at the profection years and started looking at who their Time Lord was and transits of these things. The Time Lord was always where the asteroids were, or like they were always
Mm,
transiting the asteroids or things like that. And so it was really crazy that like every
mm,
time these big years where she was put on the spotlight for this abuse with Dan Schneider, like those were the years that
mm,
Venus was her Time Lord, and she
hmm.
has this asteroid on Venus. So things like that I've been finding over and over and over. Like if it's not on the sun, moon, or rising or the chart ruler, I've been looking at the Time Lord for the year that something happened, and it's been like eerily accurate.
That's so interesting. And that also, for context for folks, like annual profections is an ancient Hellenistic technique, and the first
Mhm.
asteroid was discovered in, I believe, 1801 when Ceres was
Yeah,
discovered, but definitely
yeah,
1800s. And so asteroids are not something that the ancient astrologers were working
yeah,
with in any
definitely not.
way. So it's just so fun. I think that's one of the
Yeah,
like really exciting things about being in astrology now because we've
yeah.
had this massive translation of ancient astrological texts translated to
Hmm.
English since the 90s, and we're in kind of this renaissance of recovering these old techniques and applying them to our modern
Hmm.
days and making sense of them and adding to them. And it makes a lot of sense to me that there would be significance with the asteroids in profections because at its
Yeah.
core, one of the most useful things about profections is identifying what parts of your natal chart, because like your natal chart as a whole fulfills your natal promise, right? Like when you're born and you take your first breath, you become a talisman for whatever the planets and asteroids and fixed stars and all of those celestial bodies, whatever they're doing in the sky when you take your first breath, you're then a talisman for that, and you have your whole life to live out the potential of what's going on in that chart. But that doesn't mean that you live out every single story in your chart all the time for, 80 to
Right.
100 years. There's different periods in your life when different parts of your story may feel more or less activated. And annual profections, as well as other Time Lord techniques, are the
Yeah.
techniques you use to identify when is this part of my chart, when is this story what I'm playing out versus when is this story. And especially asteroids are so helpful for identifying what stories are present in our lives. It makes a lot of sense that like
Yeah.
that profections would then highlight like, okay, if you have these asteroids and they're not on a point of life in the sun moon ascendant, but there's the story is still showing up really loud, like yeah, that would make a lot of sense that it would be the perfected Time Lord who would then be the one who would be activating that story for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were several, like, while I've been doing this asteroid research, because I've been, a lot of people haven't done the research with asteroids, so there's not a whole lot
Hmm.
to read. There's not a whole lot, like I'm kind of just trying to find it. And so when I read these stories and I try to think of how they can translate, I've been trying to look them up in celebrity charts. And every single time I've found one in a celebrity chart, it's been related to the Time Lord. So it has been cool to watch these ancient techniques like even work with things that are as new as the asteroids or as like unstudied as the asteroids too.
Hmm.
Like I just I can't even tell you how many times I've been shocked by
Hmm.
looking at things like that and finding it to work. Um, because it's not really something that's talked about. It's not really hasn't really been researched before. So it's
Hmm.
so cool to watch like even as we become more of a modern society. And me and my partner have been talking about this a lot lately too, because I'm a little more Hellenistic than he is. He kind of studies a little bit of everything, but tends to use it more in a psychological, like modern way. Um, and I've just been finding that we were arguing about certain things and then just realizing we were actually saying the same thing. And
Hmm.
we were like, oh, wait a minute. Like a lot of these modern takes, like even though they've been shifted and changed. Like we do have to kind of shift into a modern world.
Hmm.
And so like that being said, it's really cool to watch these old techniques like still work even with more modern things filtered in or, they
Hmm.
still show up in our lives so prominently.
Well, and it speaks to the way that while our lives in many ways are very obviously different than people living in ancient Rome,
Right.
the core experience of being human and like the life topics that are important to all of us and
Mm-hmm.
the way we make sense of how we exist, like a lot of that does stay the same. Like the whole
Sure.
psychological like analysis approach, that's definitely a lot more modern. But it
Right.
is also really cool to be able to connect to these ancient peoples and see the way that they made sense of things. And also, just as an like caveat, a lot of this astrologer was for very wealthy, or a lot of this astrology was for like
Yeah.
very wealthy elite people. It was for like men and property owners and people in power and not for people like me and Lori or most of you guys listening. So it's like there's a lot we do need to do to deconstruct and like make
Right.
astrology more relevant to us.
For
But there
sure.
is still this like innate part of just being human that astrology speaks to that's really interesting. And then seeing how different people
Absolutely.
across time and space use astrology can say a lot about what's important to them. And
Yeah.
I know Michael J. Morris, I think they said this in their podcast with Chris Brennan about transgender experiences in astrology, that what we
Mm.
study astrologically reflects what we care about as a culture and as a people. And so that's
Yes.
something that's important as well to be looking at like what you're prioritizing with how you use your
Absolutely.
astrology. But that's just a
Yeah.
little tangent, but just so
For
interesting.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I've been reading a lot of ancient texts recently and just thinking about how interesting it is to like look at how they used to translate the houses or how they used to talk about the
Mm,
houses and how to make them relevant today. And then in the perfections, like how to bring those things into your life.
hmm.
Um, and we've been teaching a course on astrology, kind of like a 101. And we were talking about that a lot last week with the sixth house, and how the sixth house used to be like a house of slavery. But now it's kind of like, what are you becoming a slave to? Right? Like, how do we
Mm,
almost reword some of the ways that, like, things back then, obviously, like, have changed a lot now.
hmm.
And the problems that we used to have or they used to have, are not necessarily the problems we have, but now we have different problems. And so it's kind of like, how do you modernize these things and make them work?
Hmm.
Which,
Well,
like,
and okay, finish your thought. Sorry.
oh no, I was gonna say, like, yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but it is so interesting to like look at techniques like this and kind of like tie it back in and see how it
Hmm.
used to work for them, but now how does it work for us?
Yeah, sorry. The
Go
moon's in
ahead.
Aries right now, so I'm just like interrupt.
I know. Feels that
But
way for sure.
I just have so much to say about the sixth house that I will not say here because Lori and I do plan
For
on
sure.
talking more about the houses next year. But I have like my sect light is in the sixth house, and so is my Saturn.
Hmm.
I have a very loud sixth house, and so I have so much to say about that.
Yeah,
And like 100% things change and shift over time, but they also don't. And unfortunately,
right.
slavery is still like there are definitely people experiencing slavery in modern day. This is
Absolutely.
still a problem. There's many forms of slavery, and sixth house experiences can speak to that. But the sixth house can
Absolutely.
also speak to, work we do that's not for our benefit, but for the benefit of someone else. And the
Yes.
sixth house also has very ancient significations and connections to insurrections and revolutionary behavior that you can also see coming up in modern day as well. And so the sixth
Yeah.
house is just it's such a nuanced house to talk about, and there's so much that happens
Yeah.
in there. So yeah, we should definitely do an episode on that. And then, like you said,
Yeah.
just the ways that our relationship to house topics changes over time. Or the ninth
Hmm.
house as well is another good one because
Yeah, for
travel
sure.
used to be considered a much more difficult thing. Like if you lived in the ancient
Right.
world and you were traveling all the time, that would be incredibly dangerous and difficult. Whereas
Right.
now, we have all of these like travel bloggers and people backpacking around the world, and like our
Yeah.
relationship to travel has changed with how much easier it is to do. So it's really interesting to to look at that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it used to be not only dangerous and difficult, but like if you didn't have money or if you weren't a person of importance or power, then you were not going to be able to do it. Um,
Unless you put yourself in the sixth house and became like an indentured servant or
sure,
something like
for
that,
sure.
yes, so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it is pretty cool um to see just how things can shift over time.
Hmm. For sure. And when they stay the same.
Yeah,
So
and when they don't
interesting.
when they don't change at all. Ugh.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting back to annual profections, one other thing that I just think is really fascinating is the way astrology in general can help us identify patterns and repeating themes that come through our lives. And annual
Hmm.
profections can be a really easy way to hone in on that. That, like, when you're 9, 21, 33, 45, 57, etc., you're in a 10th house year. And so it's like every 12 years, similar themes in your life might come up. And I like to think of that as a spiral, and it's not
Hmm.
like an exact circle where, when you're 21, it'll feel exactly like it did when you were 9. But similar themes and experiences may show up. And if you're, coming up on a birthday and you're like, what is in store for me in my 30th year of life or this coming year of my life, looking back on the last time that house was perfected for you can give you clues as to what to expect in this coming year.
Yeah.
Um, and also, we're not going to go too in depth into this, but you can perfect from anything in any time frame. And so, annual perfections is moving the ascendant forward one house each year, which is like the simplest way to do it. But you can also perfect from the sun, you can perfect from the moon, you can perfect from the lot of fortune. You could even
Mhm.
perfect from like the ruler of your seventh house to see what's going on with your partner. There's so many ways you can work with just the concept of
Yeah.
moving forward. And you can also do monthly perfections. You can do weekly, daily, hourly perfections. You can do them in any time frame. And
Hmm.
I have personally found a lot of nuance and like support in working with monthly perfections in general, because it's like, okay, if I'm in this whole Pisces year, each month will have a slightly different flavor based off of like what house is perfected by month for me.
Hmm.
And the way you work with that is that when you have your birthday is when you enter your new perfected year. And so that becomes like, okay, if you're entering your Pisces year. So now Jupiter's your time lord, Pisces, your sixth house, or whatever house is ruled by Pisces. That gives you a lot of nuance for the whole year. And then the first month of that year of life is also that same house and sign is perfected by month. So, like when I turned 29 on November 2nd, I entered a Pisces perfection year and a Pisces perfection month. And then there's multiple different ways, depending on which ancient text you're referencing, to determine when you enter the next perfected month. But the technique that I
Hmm.
prefer to use is that when the sun by transit gets to the degree that your natal sun is in the next sign. Because, like, on your solar return, the sun returns to where it was in the sky when you were born, and that's when you enter a new perfected year and then the same perfected month. And so on my birthday, the sun was at 9 degrees Scorpio. That's my solar return. And so then the next month, when the sun hit 9 degrees of Sagittarius, that is then when I entered an Aries perfected month. And then next month, when the sun hits 9 degrees of Capricorn, I will then enter a Taurus perfected month, and you can move through. And so then it's like, if Jupiter is my time lord for the year, and the whole year is like Jupiter's in charge, Jupiter themes are loud for me. Each month, I then get a secondary time lord who is the planet that rules that sign. So, right now, if I'm in an Aries month, I have Jupiter as my time lord and Mars is my secondary time lord. And I actually have those conjunct in my chart. So then my Mars, Jupiter, and Sag, that natal promise is like really playing out this month. There's a lot more of that going on. So that
Yeah.
can be a really helpful way, even if you're like, okay, well, when's my 11th house perfected month? Because I want to plan a trip with my friends. Or, oh, it's a 12th house perfected month. Maybe I chill out a little bit more. Or it's a fourth house perfected month and I'm going to reorganize my house. Like you can work with it so many ways planning the year ahead.
Yeah.
But this also brings me back to the medical astrology example that I like kind of started with my ACL and then didn't finish
Yeah.
was so I have my moon and Saturn conjunct in the sixth house. And so that's a natal promise. And I have a night chart. So Saturn's particularly difficult and the moon is my sect light. And so there's a natal promise there that like my body is not the easiest body to inhabit. You know, Saturn's being pretty hard on my moon. The sixth house is hard on my moon. It just feels like I constantly need to maintain my body. And it's very easy for me to get sick and injured. And my vitality is like it's not like Lori's Aries moon at the top of the sky, like very different lunar experiences. But like I was saying with like perfections can help you identify, well, when is that natal promise going to be louder or less loud? Because it's not like
Yes.
24/7, my body is just like a prison to inhabit, but sometimes
Right,
it
of
feels
course.
like that. And so last year, Saturn was my perfected Time Lord for the year. I was in an Aquarius year. And then to the day that I entered my Cancer perfection month and the moon became my perfected Time Lord by month, to the day is when I tore my ACL. And that like really brought me into this sixth house natal promise, which is
Yeah.
just so crazy to see. And so yeah, monthly perfections can give you a lot more nuance. And then to add to that, you can also really look at the transits that are just happening in the sky to get more nuance on what is happening in your chart. Because the other thing that was happening was this was in March of 2024 when Mars and Saturn conjoined at, I believe it was 14 degrees Pisces. My moon is at 13 degrees Pisces. So I knew there was going to be like a Mars Saturn conjunction on top of my moon, not comfortable, not good for your body. In my sixth house, Mars rejoices in the sixth house. Mars likes to bring accidents. And so, like, to the day, I have this Mars Saturn conjunction on top of my moon. Saturn's already my Time Lord. So, any transit with Saturn, if Saturn's your Time Lord, is like extra loud, extra important. And then I'm entering like a Cancer perfection month that activates my moon. And all of that turns out to be a torn ACL, a horrible ski injury. Saturn also rules my fifth house of hobbies and sports and skiing. So it's like, well, how did this injury occur through fifth house topics? I'm in a fifth house perfection year. And it was an injury that ended up needing surgery because it was an accident that needed surgery. Those are Mars things. So there's just like it's crazy when you dig into how
Yeah.
much annual perfections can give you those details. And just to like really finish that by saying like there's so much data with astrology. Like there's always all these huge transits and all these big things happening. And it can be really overwhelming to make sense of like what that means for you personally or how you will personally experience that in your life. And that's one reason why having a Time Lord technique like Profections can really help you identify if Saturn's your Time Lord, pay attention to what Saturn's doing by transit all year, what planets. If Venus aspects Saturn, that might be a time of more help for you. And then if Mars aspects Saturn, maybe you don't go skiing that day or, just paying attention to what the transits of your perfected Time Lord are doing will give you, like for me now this year, Jupiter transits are a lot bigger of a deal than solar transits. But when I'm in a Leo year, I'll be really paying attention to the sun. So that can help you just sort through the astro data to know like what matters the most for you.
Yeah. Hey, that's really awesome that you like are able to really look back and see so many different techniques like helping you work through something that's really difficult, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, yeah. And something else that just popped in my head, and maybe you remember this, also, but there was a NORWAC lecture this year on medical astrology that talked a little bit about annual perfections. And she pointed out how interesting it is that most people get sick in the month before their birthday. And she
Mm-hmm.
was saying that it was kind of this like 12th housey type of energy, like a final energy, a final push before you enter a new
Hmm.
perfected year. And that's something I've thought about a lot because I I always get sick in the month before my birthday, but the month before my birthday starts like basically on Christmas. Like my birthday's at the end of January. And so I was like, yeah, everyone gets sick in early January. I thought that was just kind of an everyone thing. Um, so when she said that, it kind of like shook me up a little bit and I started paying a little more attention. I also work with solar returns a lot and I have read several books on like how people interpret solar returns and one book I particularly liked mentioned that 3 months exactly before your birthday if you hadn't finished everything that chart had said you were going to do, there might be some sort of energetic push to start getting those things done.
Mm,
And I started noticing that on October 27th, which is 3 months before my birthday, every year I start getting really antsy and I start like rushing to finish things. And winter has always just been kind of a stressful time in general for me because of that. Like, okay, let's get everything done. And so I started looking at it as like, okay, maybe that's a solar return thing. But then understanding the month before your birthday gives, and it's going to change every year, but it does give a little bit of that 12th housey energy like, oh, I'm about to shift, I'm about to change, I'm
hmm
going to be reborn. It's about to be a new year. I'm about to be given a new solar return chart or, a new Time Lord, a new space. And so when I kind of shifted that perspective, it's kind of helped me to like go a little slower right before my birthday or like in those winter months. Um, and yeah, it kind of can give this like, oh, maybe that's why I'm feeling sick or run down or
hmm
stressed. And that I've found that to be pretty useful as well.
For sure. Yeah, that was a Kira Sutherland lecture,
That's
and
what I
she is
thought.
an
Okay.
incredible medical astrologer, so and a naturopath from Australia. So highly recommend. I think it's like Solar Returns in Medical Astrology. You can probably find it
Yeah,
on the
that sounds
NORWAC
right.
website, maybe even on Kira's website, but highly recommend Kira Sutherland's
Yeah.
work in general for people who are more interested in medical astrology. And then just like and then that's a more modern approach to solar returns, which is it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
back to like what we were saying with the renaissance of astrology and how fun it is. Like Kira's very like she is constantly seeing clients. She is very empirical in like what
Mm-hmm.
is she witnessing happening. Um, so then it's like we're able to really add nuance to the other
Yeah.
techniques. I also don't know how trained in Hellenistic astrology Kira is specifically, because
I'm
like
not
when we're
sure.
talking about annual profections in relation to solar returns from like the Hellenistic lineage specifically, they
Yeah.
work with solar returns to look at your perfected Time Lord and the
Yes.
condition in the solar return chart to give additional, like if I just entered a Pisces year, just using myself as an example, all over the place here, then part of that is there's the natal promise of my Jupiter and Sagittarius in the third house being very activated for me this whole year. But on my birthday, Jupiter was and still is in Gemini. And so there's a huge difference in dignity for this specific Pisces year than in 12 years. I guess also Jupiter's an interesting example because Jupiter already has a 12-year cycle, but it's
Yeah.
like
I was
every
gonna say Jupiter
but
Jupiter's
like if
cycle is
we're working
always
with
like that.
Saturn or Venus or
Yeah.
something who don't like repeat themselves every 12 years, like in 12 years your perfected Time Lord might have a different condition or even like this year it was very beautiful on my birthday. It was a Venus Jupiter opposition. And so because Jupiter's my Time Lord, that Venus Jupiter opposition is like especially baked in to
Hmm.
this 29th year of life. Um, in a way, like looking at what aspects the planet is making in your solar return chart, looking at its dignity and all of that can be really helpful from the Hellenistic perspective. But then also taking like, okay, if that's what they did, what makes sense for us here now? And Kira is really like doing a lot of real life,
Yeah.
like creative work with solar return charts. But just to really clarify, you're not literally
Right.
in a 12th house profection month the month before your birthday. Like the month before my birthday this year, I was in a fourth house profection month.
Yes.
So it does differ. And for me personally, I actually don't resonate as much with that technique Kira shared because my
Hmm.
sun is in Scorpio in the second house. And so before my birthday is Libra season, and all of these planets are moving through my first house. So I actually really experience by transit
Hmm.
every year before my birthday. Like I always joke, I celebrate my birthday for all of October and like have all this fun, like during Libra season with all these planets moving through my first house. Like maybe if I'm lucky, Venus is also in Libra. It's a great time. And then we get, I live in the northern hemisphere. I live like I cannot see any sky right now. It's very
Right.
gray in the Willamette Valley. So we get to like November 2nd and it's so dark and cold and it's Scorpio season and everyone's worn out after Halloween and it's just depressing. So then it's like
Yeah.
I feel like honestly my birthday puts me more into a 12th house experience,
Totally.
whereas like the month before it was very first house. So it's also going to be more
Oh,
nuanced
for
for each
sure.
person, but
Yeah.
definitely so
And
interesting.
Yeah, she definitely takes a way more modern interpretation of it. And so of course, like take that with a grain of salt or like maybe go watch that talk and see which,
Hmm.
what you resonate with. But when she said that, something about it like struck me as like super interesting because I do feel like
Hmm.
that can be very, um, yeah, that can be very true too. So even just it's interesting to start mixing all of the techniques and making them more modern and stuff, but you
Hmm.
can find a lot of correlation with all of them.
Absolutely. And it's just meaning making. And like I said with Kira, she's
Absolutely,
so
that too.
empirical with like
Yeah,
she's just working with so many clients. So honestly, I would listen to Kira more than some like random dead text in certain ways too,
sure.
because it's like
Yeah,
she's in it with like
she's
what people are
watching more of it.
experiencing today in real life. So there's, you
Yeah,
mix the theory and the technique and the what you're seeing, and everyone has their own flair on
yeah.
things.
Yeah,
Nice.
absolutely. And you kind of have to.
Exactly. That's astrology. That's how we have astrology be a living practice.
Yeah,
I'm just looking back. I had a few notes, so I want to make sure we covered everything. Do you have anything else
sure
to
thing.
say about all of this, Lori?
I don't think so. Yeah, those were the biggest things that I have found.
Yeah. I'm seeing like I had a note about how this is an opportunity to learn more about a part of your chart. So that's
Hmm.
true too. Like I'm
That's
learning
true.
so much about the Pisces part of my chart because I'm also in my Saturn return in Pisces. So it's like when I
Yeah.
started studying astrology and Saturn was like in Capricorn and I was like so far from my Saturn return. It's like, okay, well, I can read theory about what it means to have Moon Saturn in Pisces in the sixth house, but you don't really know until you experience it what that means for you personally. And so, especially parts of your chart that you might be a little more confused about, dark houses, things where
Hmm.
it's just less clear, profections can be a really good time to learn more about what that story means for you.
For sure.
And then just the
Especially
fact,
houses, sorry, especially
no,
empty
you go ahead.
houses. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And also just to speak to empty houses, just because you don't have a planet in a house does not mean that house is not super influential
Right.
in your life. And that, again, Lori and I will talk more about houses next year, so we can get into that. But empty houses are still very important in your chart,
Hmm.
and especially when they're activated by perfection, they'll be particularly loud.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, I feel like that's everything I had to say. I guess just like the TLDR is working with techniques that are easy to apply in your day-to-day life that really make things personally of like, what does this mean for me? That's my favorite way to work with astrology. I think just like every morning, I'll check the weather to see if I need a raincoat when I go outside, which I always do in the Willamette Valley in the winter. But it's like just knowing what astrology is being activated for you and what that means for you personally gives you like so much agency. It can help you cultivate a lot more harmony. Like it's like I really got
Yeah.
into paddleboarding this summer.
Mm.
And there was one time when me and my partner, I like tied him to my paddleboard in an inner tube, and he's like a big guy. And we were just floating on this beautiful lake with like petrified volcanic preserved forest underneath. And it was an amazing experience. But
Mm.
there was like this current that just like took us all the way across the lake. And so at the end, when we had to paddle in, I'm like on my paddleboard, like going against the current, like lugging my
Yeah.
like large boyfriend behind me. And it was exhausting and it
Oh,
took so long as opposed to like another paddle we went and did in the Willamette River where we're going along with the current. We just kind of have to paddle around like, oh, there's a log and that was like an hour and we just got right through. And I feel like astrology can help you be like, okay, well, if the energetic current is
mhm,
here, how about we put ourselves in here and we flow with it? Because you can paddle upstream, and if you want to, go right ahead. But if you can
mhm.
identify where the currents are to flow with them more, it's just easier to have more harmony. It's easy to have more cohesion. It's easier to make sense when things are difficult and be like, okay, well, there wasn't really a lot of energy around career for me that year. So it makes sense that I actually did not succeed as much, even though I was working really hard. Whereas if you'd
Mhm.
waited till a 10th house profection year, depending on the natal promise of your 10th house, it's just, it really helps you kind of live more in alignment with the skies when you're able to use techniques like this.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, sign up for my workshop if you're interested in learning more. It will be recorded in a way that is kind of evergreen and will always be applicable for people, even if it's not 2025 anymore. So, if you really want
Mhm.
to just dig into what this means for you personally, if you want to have some journal prompts, look at the nuance of your own chart, and talk more about assessing planetary condition and solar return charts and monthly profections and all those fun little nuances, then the information to sign up is down below. And if you're listening right now and you sign up before the end of the day on Friday the 13th, 2024, December 13th, then you can get a bonus thing of 30 pages all about the astrology of 2025 and the transits of 2025 as well. So go ahead and sign up for that if you're interested. Lori's
Yeah.
workshop information as well will be down below. Do you want to share more about that, Lori?
Sure, yeah. We've been doing a lot of online, or sorry, in person, not online, series at my shop recently. And so we've been bringing in some really nice recording stuff and trying to make sure that we have really good videos and recordings of all of the courses. So we just finished our Astrology 101 course, which we're happy to send out if anybody reaches out for it. And we're doing our asteroid workshop coming up this coming Sunday, so the 15th. Um, and so we are going to have an option where people can zoom in and kind of be part of it there. We're going to print off charts that have all the asteroids we're going to be talking about so you can see your own and watch them play out. Otherwise, I'm still collecting stories for the book. I'm still writing. We've been traveling a lot. Um, Everything is kind of just, yeah, there's just been a lot of work. There's been a lot of really fun stuff, but um, yeah.
Well, and Lori is an example at the beginning when I'm like, if you're in a sixth house, eighth house, 12th house year, maybe it's better to step back depending on your personal
Hmm.
chart. Lori's an example of being in an eighth house perfection year. She has like a stellium of planets there, really strong
Yeah.
Saturn there. Her eighth house years are not years where she's stepping back. So that's
No.
where like knowing the nuance of your personal birth chart and your natal promise can really help. And so just shout
Yeah.
out to Lori for everything you've accomplished in your eighth house year, because wow, you've been doing a lot.
It's been a crazy year. Crazy eighth house.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope this technique is really helpful for you, and we'll be back soon with more episodes.
Yeah.